we'd like to introduce Elianna Rosenthal. She is here tonight from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, where she's a habitat biologist with a special love for aquatic critters and ecosystems that started when she was a child, and she has studied juvenile Chinook salmon and currently works helping out with permitting, letter writing, and project assistance with private landowners as well as partnering organizations. So we're really excited to have a talk about fish, because I don't know if we've ever really had a talk about the Highlands fish before. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Ellie.
So I'm someone who talks with my hands a lot, so I apologize in advance. Handling a microphone while talking, we'll see how it goes. So if I'm not talking loud enough, please let me know. I will not be offended. So I'm just going to start, I guess I'll start off. So here I'm talking about swimming the Highlands, the secret life of the Okanogan Salmonids. So as they said, I'm Ellie, or Elianna Rosenthal. I am a habitat biologist with WDFW. I've been in my position for 3 years now. So one question that I have been asked so many times, and it's usually by the younger generation, is how did you get to your job? Why are you here? What brought you here? And it's always interesting, especially in natural resources, the different paths people take. Sometimes it's a nice linear, and sometimes there's a little bit of stops on the way. And so I grew up in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. I always loved being in water. I loved anything with water. In high school, I had an amazing opportunity to do an internship with Sea Life Minnesota. So there, I was working with sea turtles and sharks, and doing some husbandry and just feeding them. And then from there, I went to University of Manitoba and did my undergrad in zoology with a minor in environmental science. I graduated from undergrad and I was like, I don't know what I want to do. I want to do something with fish. So I went to Alaska for a year and worked in hatcheries. I did 3 different hatcheries, and these were remote. Like, you take a 2-seater plane or a boat to get there. There are no roads. There's hundreds of millions of fish, some bears, and some eagles and whales, and that's about it. And there is where I found my love of salmon. Before then, I was like, salmon is delicious to eat, but just working with all 5 species of Pacific salmon, and I just saw how resilient and interesting and unique each one was. So from there, I went to Fresno State, where I did my master's in growth rate variation of juvenile Chinook salmon. And I used their ear bones or their otoliths to look at growth rates and hopefully try to advocate for updating biogenetic models. From there, it was hard getting a job in natural resources. So I actually was a fish tech for a few months with the department, and then I did stock assessment. And then COVID hit, and I was the first one in. I was the last one in, first one out. And I actually did work at Starbucks for about a year, and I loved working at Starbucks. And uniquely enough, that actually helped me get my current job. And I had all this education, I had all this experience, but they were like, you have spent the last year of your life working with customers, providing customer service. You are there when they're in their good moods, or when they're yelling at you because they want a white chocolate mocha, not a white mocha. Yes, that has happened. And then luckily I got into this position. Never in my life did I think I would get into permitting and think it was a fun job. I love my job. Every week is different, everything is different. My number one thing in my job is anytime you want to do a project that impacts the better flow of waters and states, you need a permit, and I issue that permit. It's a HPA. And so if there's potential impacts to fish life or fish habitat, that's where you need that permit. So if you guys have upcoming projects you're interested in, I have cards with me. But that's just a small portion. I also follow up on violations. So if people are, drive a tractor into the creek and start digging it up. I also comment on timber sales, on land use, and a little bit of everything. So last week I was doing stuff with Golden Eagle. Next week, I'm doing stuff with Concanelli Dam. So it's very diverse. So I do a little bit of everything. So I'm always learning in this position. So today, I will be talking about the Okanogan Highlands. salmonids of the highlands, what their habitat requirements are, what the outlook of the salmonid population is, improving the future, and then see if you guys have any questions. So, when I first was asked to talk about the Highlands, my first question to Jen and Sarah was, where are the Okanogan Highlands? I knew a general region, okay, it's somewhere over here on the map, but I could never know boundaries. And this was the response I got from Jen and Sarah. I'll let you guys read it. But it was helpful to know, just having more of those boundaries or outlines of the area. And what's interesting is looking at, how much of, I think it's right, okay. Just how much of the Highlands is actually influenced by Canada. And just another map, because I'm a Washington transplant, obviously, and I'd never heard of OMAC 3 years ago. So I'm still learning this area. But I found these maps really helpful to be like, okay, so we have Chisa, we have Tenasket, Oroville over here, so this kind of area. So the watersheds of the Okanogan Highlands, there's actually 3 watersheds that encompass the United States side of the Okanogan Highlands. We have Raya 49, which is the Okanogan watershed. Let's see, there we go. So we have Okanogan River, and then we have 9 Mile, Tenasket, Antoine, Siwash, and Bonaparte. And then we have the Kettle watershed with Myers and Terota, and then Lost Creek in the Sandpoil watershed. Essentially, the main thing with this is it's a semi-arid, high-elevation landscape, and it's really shaped by a unique geology, but then also water scarcity. And some major lakes of the Okanogan Highlands, we have Sidley Lake, Molson Lake, Lost Lake, and Bonaparte Lake. Oh, there we go. And one thing I found, this is kind of just an interesting thing I noticed while looking at all these lakes, 3 out of the 4 of them have loons. Yes, Sidley and Molson are like right next to each other, but I thought that was kind of fun. Being from Minnesota, I always have to appreciate my loons. So fun shout out to them. But the watershed of the Okanogan Highlands, so it's a part of the Upper Columbia River Basin with major tributaries, the Okanogan, the Sandpoil, and Kettle rivers. And it contributes to the Columbia River flows and regional hydrology. The Highlands, as we all know, experience a semi-arid climate with hot summers and typically cold, snowy winters, still crossing our fingers for a little bit more of that snowpack. But then there's variation in precipitation and temperature due to the elevation and topography. But there's also competing demands. We have the natural resources that are utilized in the landscape, but then we also have the human influences. And most of the water, what's really interesting that's coming into the Okanogan watershed, actually originates in British Columbia. So for precipitation, it varies. The lower elevations are going to have less of the precipitation. And we're a snow melt driven system with the highest stream flow occurring during that freshet in April when the snow's melting and pushing out. In the higher areas, the freshet might be a little bit later this year. It'll be interesting to see when it happens. And then we have those low flows from August through October. And one thing that's really interesting is due to extensive bedrock, only a fraction of this precipitation is able to become groundwater available for human and economic uses. So just diving into the history of the Okanogan Highlands, there is a long history of resource development. In the 1800s, there is intensive beaver trapping. And I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Met Okanogan Beaver Project or Alexa Whipple, but she will tell you about beavers and how wonderful they are. And they're ecosystem engineers. They're building dams. They're slowing down water. They're doing water storage and recharging groundwater. And so eliminating or decimating the population can have catastrophic impacts to the ecosystem. And in the 1850s, we have discovery of gold and other hard rock mining. And so there's going to be habitat destruction, erosion, contamination, and also sedimentation, which we'll touch on a little bit. So in the 1800s to 1930s, there's grazing allotments, and from the early to mid-1900s, streams were nearly drawn dry because of irrigation. And in my digging of just trying to get a better understanding of the Okanogan Highlands, I found this, the first issue of the OMAC Chronicle. And one thing I found interesting was the amount of mention of water, lumber, trees, and so just already there is so much use of the natural resources. And the addition of cows, I don't know how many of you like to hike in, DNR property, but you see what those grazing can do and how the creeks can be decimated with all the vegetation and just eroding banks. So the 1900s to now, we have more people, we have more use of the resources, and so we have to keep up with population demands. And so there's problems with additional fish barriers, pollution sources, and habitat degradation. So salmonids is a category of species in the family Salmonidae, and it encompasses a lot of different fish, so trout, salmon, char. And just within the trout, salmon, and char, there are as many as 120 recognized species. And Salmonidae actually means family of ray fin fish. So when you think of those salmon, their fins, you can always kind of spread out like a nice fan. So looking at the phylogeny of the subfamily Salmonidae, we have three main genres. We have Oncorhynchus. So those are most of the fish that you think of when you think of salmon, coho, chinook, sockeye, cutthroat, chum. And Oncorhynchus comes from a word called hooked snout, and it's referring to the upper lower jaw in mature males, how it's really curved. And then we have salmo, and then, so that's gonna be the brown trout and Atlantic salmon, and then we have Salmonids, which is lake trout and brook trout. And the way these three are divided, Oncorhynchus and salmo, these are divided from the Salmonids by color. So the Oncorhynchus and salmo, the fish will have a lighter background with dark spots, and then the lake trout and brook trout have a darker background with lighter spots. And then the division between these right here comes from distinctive bones in their head, and then also their vomers are different. It's like a bone in their mouth that has like teeth helping them for getting prey. So I'll be talking about the Potamodromus, sorry, I'm always used to sing anadromous, so talking about just freshwater life cycles, this has been a new one for me. But the freshwater life cycles. So typically, when fish go to spawn, their nest is called a redd. It's R-E-D-D. And what happens is females will clear gravel with their tail and deposit the eggs, and then the males will immediately fertilize it and cover with gravel. So when they do this, most of these species will then leave. They don't stand there and guard the nest necessarily. And one female can lay up to 2,000 eggs per pound. It's going to depending on species, depending on the size of the fish, and other environmental and genetic factors. And hatch rate also will depend anywhere from 3 weeks to 4 months. Yet again, it's going to depend on those water temps. The water temperature really will influence their development. And so this is what the eggs will look like, and then as they develop, they usually have these dark spots, and that's what we call their eyed. And another 1 to 2 months after they're eyed, then they will hatch. And then they'll turn into alvin. And these are nourished by their sac, so their sac will give them all the required nutrients that they need. And they stay hidden in the gravel for protection until they absorb their sacs, and then they'll swim out from the gravel. And they actually have to go up to the top and gulp up some air to fill up their swim bladders. And then we have fry, par, and fingerling. So some will rear in their natal stream while others will go look for feeding territories. And they'll stay in the shallows feeding on zooplankton. And fry and par are kind of territorial and solitary, so they don't stay in big groups. So right here, these are these par marks. And then fingerling is essentially when they're the size of a finger, they're 3 to 4 inches long. So when they're adult, they're close to sexual maturity, they'll go back to their natal stream. The colors of the fish starts changing. Males will get this kype, as you can see right here, that hooked lower jaw, which is actually important when it comes to breeding because it can help them fight off males and nip at each other. But they're not going to guard nest once the females release their eggs. So just a reiteration of the life cycle. So they're going to be upstream, they're going to hang out, and then at some point, depending on the fish, but also depending on the environment, they might hang out and feed, or they might go downstream to feed. They'll get bigger, then they go back upstream. One of my slides missing. Interesting. Okay. They got switched around. We'll go with this. Okay, sorry. So I keep saying the fish go back to their natal stream. They go back to where they were born, where they hatched. And so this is due to olfactory imprinting. It's not something inherited. And so imprinting happens when they emerge from the gravel, and it's a period of rapid and irreversible learning. And what's so interesting, though, is that you can have eggs from Alaska, and you can ship them to a different stream, a different system, a different state, but as long as when they are alevin and they come up, and they're in this water they're supposed to be in, then they can imprint there. And then also for anadromous fish, the imprinting comes more when, so anadromous is going from freshwater to salt and back to fresh. And when they become smolts, that's when they get that imprinting of, this is my home, this is where I need to come back when I'm older. There's also hypotheses of, there's pheromones emitted by the juveniles, so the adults know where to kind of sniff out and go. And then there's also looking at celestial and electromagnetic cues to give fish a compass directing them where to go back. So there are different life histories. There's adfluvial, fluvial, and resident. So the adfluvial, they're going to migrate out of the tributaries into a lake or reservoir to forage, and then return to their home tributary to spawn. And these fish tend to be larger and have higher fecundity or have more eggs than their fluvial or resident forms. The fluvial, this is stream dwelling, and so they will use relatively larger streams and rivers, spending their entire life cycle in those flowing waters, and then return to smaller rivers or streams to spawn. And then the resident, they stay essentially where they were born. And some places, this is actually my favorite, this is a recent picture. We were walking a stream in the Tianaway, and they were saying how the fish hasn't been seen for over 10 years, but it's still fish bearing, and it was like this for hundreds of feet. And I kid you not, I saw this little splash in the water, and one of my coworkers got a net out, and we were like, oh, it's still fish bearing. And it just baffles me that this was during higher flows, and fish were still there. And to make things a little bit more interesting or confusing is that each of these life history variants can occur in a single breeding population. And these life histories are also tied to climatic regimes. So during wetter seasons, they're more likely to migrate out. But then during drier seasons, they're more likely to kind of stay where they are and buckle down. So this is going to be some audience participation. So I keep saying the salmon, they spawn, they go out, they come back to their natal stream. So, but once in a while, some of them will stray like this guy right here. So I'm going to ask raise of hands who thinks it's more important to go back to your home and spawn. No one? Okay, so we have a few. And then who thinks, okay, you should stray, you should go check out the other place and go spawn. Okay. And you want to know who the winner is? I'm going to take a break. Okay, the winner is, technically everyone was right and everyone was wrong. So both are actually really critical to populations continuing. So natal homing, you have, I was born here, I survived here. You have proven suitability for survivorship. But you also have the local adaptations of the different temperatures, the flows, the fish has adapted for that area. But there are also people who say natal homing is a recipe for extinction. If there's a significant development, if there's a poisoning, if there's a barrier, this whole entire population can cease to exist, and then they're gone. Their genetics are gone. But if you stray, the one issue is, what if you go check out different habitat and it ends up being worse than your home habitat? But also, it's important because this will maintain genetics. So if you had a few that strayed and then something catastrophic happens at their home, then all of those that strayed are passing on genetics and introducing new genes, new adaptations to other populations. You can also reduce interbreeding. So as I was talking about, I worked in Alaska. We would spawn hundreds of millions of eggs. And so I got to see some interesting fish. This right here is an albino. And as cool as it was to see, one thing is they're not going to typically survive. That is really easily seen for predators, so usually they're not going to make it to adulthood or to spawn. Oops. And then here we have a two-headed fish. And I had seen plenty of them. They did not make it much further than this stage. So there's two different reproductive strategies. A lot of, pretty much all anadromous species that we think of, so Chinook, coho, they're they experience similarity, so they're one and done. They spawn, and then they die near their red, and their nutrients go back into the environment. Interoparity is they spawn multiple times, and here's a shout out to Ray Troll. He's an Alaskan artist, and he has the funniest things. He has like Return of the Sockeye and other various fish puns. He's great. So, native salmonids that are found in the Okanogan Highlands, we have the West Slope cutthroat trout, rainbow trout, and red band trout. And you'll see I have a little asterisk on the rainbow trout, and that's because I feel the need to also speak to steelhead trout. I'll speak to them a little bit more later, but steelhead and rainbow are literally the same species with different lifestyles. So rainbows will be in freshwater their entire life, where steelhead will migrate out to the salt. We don't really have anadromy up in the Okanogan Highlands, but right on the cusp, on the edge, we have Antoine Creek, and the tribe has been doing significant restoration to help restore the summer steelhead population in Okanagan. So West Slope cutthroat trout, it's a popular game fish, and it's one of 3 subspecies of cutthroat trout that occur in Washington. The other are coastal, which is native, and Lahadin, which is non-native. So they'll range from like 8 to 12 inches, but can grow up to about 16 plus inches. And it got its name from being first described west of the Continental Divide. So they have a varied life history. They can be adfluvial, fluvial, or resident. But out here, stream resident life history is the most dominant. But if you go west of us in Sahican, fluvial is more dominant, and so in Idaho, they're more fluvial also. They typically mature about 2 to 3 years old and will spawn about 4 to 5. They will spawn in March to July with a temperature of the water is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They're interoparous, so they can spawn more than once. So they can spawn annually, given the right genetics, habitat, food, a lot of factors. And they'll live 7 to 13 years depending. But repeat spawning usually varies from like 1 to 25% in the species, and so indicating a high post-spawning mortality. You put a lot of energy into producing those eggs and melt. So they like the smaller streams and higher elevations. They like the cooler waters, and they also really like pool habitat and cover. So when I say cover, I mean like undercut banks, large woody debris, large rocks, boulders. And to identify one, they're going to have that olive bronze colored back and gold sides, the red coloration on the gill right here. It's funny because, cutthroat looks literally like it's got cut in the throat. So red slash on that lower jaw right there. And then the spots, it's so interesting because the spots are primarily above the lateral line. So the lateral line's like right here. So for the most part, they're right on top there, and then they're in the posterior region right around here, just kind of having that empty belly. So the population outlook is pretty stable. They are identified as a species of greatest conservation need under SWAP, which is the State Wildlife Action Plan. One thing is they spawn in the spring and they're sensitive to the timing and magnitude of snowmelt and the accompanying flood pulse or the spring freshet. But like all fish, they're really just sensitive to water temperatures. If you have higher water temperatures, they have to eat more, they will grow more. But if you get too hot, you kill the eggs, you kill the fish, and if it's too cold, there are like different diseases or stunting that can happen. We have rainbow trout. This is the most common, most popular species of trout in Washington. They'll be about 11 to 18 inches, and there's 3 subspecies of rainbow trout in Washington state. We have coastal rainbow trout, Columbia Basin red band trout, and then steelhead. Because of their abilities to thrive in hatcheries, they have been introduced to most of the United States. So they have a varied life history. We talked about the fluvial, adfluvial, and resident. They also have anadromy. The ones in the highlands are not really going to be experiencing that anadromy, but if they somehow had a direct passage to saltwater and wasn't necessarily had barriers, there is a chance they could go out to the saltwater. They're sexually mature at 2 to 4 years old. They spawn in the late winter to early spring, so when water temps are around 40 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. They're iteroparous, meaning they can spawn multiple times throughout their life. And their average is they live about 4 to 6 years, but they can live up to 11 years old. So rainbow trout, they like varied habitats, lakes, rivers, and streams. They do like areas of significant vegetation, and that's because they really like to snack on that terrestrial insects. So like grasshoppers and ants that fall from the grasses, they will scoop those up. I feel like in general, fish really like the water that's clean, clear, and cold. But they also like complex habitat where they can hide and forage. So to identify a rainbow trout, you're looking for that blue-green back with silver sides and belly, black spots on the body and on the fins, and then you're going to have that nice pink stripe right here. Sometimes it's a solid line, and other times it can be kind of blotched. So one thing is rainbow. So one question is it a rainbow trout or is it a steelhead? In looking at the fish, you might not know. Obviously, if you're seeing the fish in the ocean, it's a steelhead. But if you're looking in freshwater, there's some ways you can know by looking at it. If it's a large, like over 26 inches, it's probably a steelhead. If there's a lot of wear and tear, it's also likely a steelhead. And that's because they have a significant further migration. They're not just hanging out, they're having to go hundreds of miles. Steelhead have more spotting, brighter colors, and a silvery sheen. Otherwise, the only way to really determine is looking at their scales or otoliths. They'll have certain markings that they went into the ocean. Otoliths are the ear bones. And what's really interesting is that these 2 life history forms can coexist in the same water bodies. They can interbreed, and their offspring can adapt a different life history. So anadromous steelhead can produce freshwater rainbow trout, and then vice versa. And it's funny, I tried to get a comment, just any type of comment on the status of rainbow trout, and all I could find is rainbow trout are common and they're kind of everywhere. When in doubt, in Okanogan County, if someone's like, oh, I have a fish-bearing stream, what fish do you think is there? When in doubt, I'm always going to assume likely rainbow trout and or brook trout. And then in 2006, the Upper Columbia River steelhead is federally listed as a threatened species. So red band trout. So this is a subspecies of rainbow trout, but they are slightly different because they have adapted traits, and they're a little bit smaller. They're only typically up to 12 inches large. The populations have historically been exposed to naturally high levels of disturbance and have developed traits that allow them to survive in conditions where rainbow trout would find inhospitable. And so their adapted traits consist of like a thermal tolerance, and they're a little bit more opportunistic feeders, and they have that smaller body size that allows them to live where other rainbow trout could not. So they're going to have a varied life history at fluvial and fluvial, and there is some anadromous red band trout in places like Oregon that go out to the ocean. They will sexually mature at about 2 to 4 years old, and they spawn in spring to early summer. They're heteroparous, so that they can spawn multiple times, and they'll live about 4 to 6 years old, sometimes up to 10 years. But it depends because they are more heat tolerant than rainbow trout, and so if the water temp is really high, then they shorten their lifespan. So they have evolved to live in everything from mountain forests to high desert streams, but they really enjoy abundance of pools, vegetated streams, and one thing I've noticed that's different is they like lower stream gradients and not as steep. So they currently occupy about 50% of their historical range, and they are identified as a species of greatest conservation need under the State Wildlife Action Plan, and it's really concerns of loss of habitat and habitat degradation for the species. So to identify red band trout, it's going to be very similar to the rainbow trout, but you have larger, more rounded spots. And then their par marks, so the marks that are kind of like, not tiger stripes, but kind of like bars across, they sometimes will remain into adulthood. And then the line right here is more rosy red or orange compared to the pink of a rainbow. And then the gill cover is a brilliant red. So just a side-by-side comparison. Also, so red band trout are typically smaller, red compared to that pink. And then I had to do a shout out to bull trout. They were historically in the Okanogan Highlands. They are called a trout, but they're actually a char, and they're closely related to lake trout and brook trout. So these fish are olive green with pale spots. They're about 10 to 12 inches. Life history will vary by population, and they are threatened. One thing about bull trout is they really like the hard-to-reach complex areas, but they really need cool water. And they are typically not found in water that rise over 59 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods. Bull trout can be found in the Met-Howe area, though. So for non-native salmonids, we have brook trout. This is an introduced game fish. They were introduced in the early 1900s and widely distributed from high mountain lakes to headwater tributaries. And they are the most prevalent game fish in wilderness and non-wilderness high lakes. They are native to the East Coast, so it's always fun. I have a coworker who's from the East Coast, and so a lot of her projects, they're like, we need to protect these, we need to make sure, and then out here, there's times where we're trying anything to get rid of them. They're about 12 to 16 inches long, and they're called a trout, but they're actually a char. So brook trout, as we talked about before, the different genera are divided based on the coloration. So these are going to have a darker background with lighter colors. They have unique red, pink spots with blue halos. They're actually I find them to be a gorgeous fish. And they also have a cool square-like tail. So one problem with brook trout is in areas that have bull trout, because they're so closely related, they will pose a threat to bull trout populations because they can breed. And the hybrids are almost always sterile, and they cannot produce offspring of their own. So if bull trout continuously are intermixing with brook trout, it'll just further their population demise. So when people are fishing, there's a few different ways you can identify, was this fish a wild, natural fish, or is this one that was produced by a hatchery? So we have right here, this is called a Floyd tag. The most recent time I think I've seen one was with Yakima Nation's Coho, and there'll be information on the tag of a number to call, and you can report it and let them know. Right here we have a coated wire tag. When the fish are about fingerling, a little smaller probably size, you'll take them in, they have these like travel trailers where you'll put the fish up on this machine, and I call it give them a little concussion, and it just shoves this little tracker into their head. And when you're doing that, typically you also will cut off that little tail right here, the adipose fin. Another way we will mark fish is with pit tags. And what you do is you take a fish and you shove a needle into their belly, and it's about the size of a grain of rice. And each one has a different code. And so the Colville Confederated Tribe uses pit tags a lot to watch the numbers of fish, and they'll have these pit tag arrays so that they can see numbers in which fish are swimming through. And then otoliths. In Alaska, we did a lot of thermal marking because there's a lot of hatcheries out in Alaska, and so they would do different marking either through temperature. So for certain days in their egg development, they would put these stressors on where it's a significant crank of temperature, and that will have this distinct bar pattern. Or there's also chemical markings you can do, which I'm not really familiar with. So to age salmonids, I always have to talk about otoliths. It's funny, when I interviewed for my graduate position, I said I want to do anything but not otoliths. And I got otoliths. And I actually fell in love with them. I call my master's kind of a glorified art project. It was dealing with fish bones that were the size of a sprinkle, and I had to learn how to sand them down to be able to see these fine lines. So this right here is about the size of a sesame seed or a sprinkle, and we then took multiple pictures, and you can see right here is when they emerged from the gravel, and then each ring is a daily deposit. So essentially it's like a tree. With the otoliths, as they get older, then you start seeing annual instead of those daily rings, and then you can also tell stressors, or so if there was a period without food or oxygen or something or thermal stress, you can see that. You can also see when they went to ocean. And also during summer, they're going to have wider bands because they're going to have grown more. And then also scales. They have cycloid fish scales, and so they add rings as they grow. So just to talk about the different habitat needs, every fish has different habitat needs, and then at the life stages, they also have different habitat needs. So when in doubt, they need good flow of clean water that has oxygen in it. Cold water is always best for these fish. It's a Goldilocks act of, if it's too cold, it can stun their growth, but if it's too warm, it can cook the eggs, it can stress them out, it can kill them. Depending on the fish, they need certain size gravel and cobble or substrate. The female needs to be able to kind of use her body, use her tail to scoop up the gravel a little bit, deposit the eggs, and then be able to move the gravel back on. And we also don't want significant influxes of silt or sediment, because these eggs, right here is a picture of a female kind of digging up, and then here are the males with the milt. And let's say someone took a huge bucket of sand and dumped it over, or you have post-fire debris flow, these eggs would be buried. You would cut off any oxygen from getting to them, any cool water, and they would all die. So that's why lots of times we care about silt and sediment. So the alvin, they'll have those yolk sacs, and they'll wiggle out once they absorb them. They'll gulp the air, and then they're going to still be pretty small and be pretty young, and so they're going to need side channels, tributaries, shallow, slow-moving water where they can feed, but also they need overhanging vegetation so that they can hide. They're the lowest on the food chain, so they need areas to hide from bigger fish or other predators. And then as they get older, as they get stronger, as they can eat more, then they move to deeper and faster areas. And then as they get even bigger, they tend to move when it flows lower or spring freshet, they'll kind of go with the water. So migration and foraging, I put this term adulting habitat. I was speaking with a colleague, I was like, what would you even call this? Like when they're older, they're out there living their life, and he's like, adulting. I was like, I'm gonna go with that. This is not a biological term though. So as they live their life, they need food. They need to be able to eat to meet their needs. They need places to hide from, whether it's from humans, dogs, any type of predator. They need places to rest. And then they also need free passage from the stream to either river, lake, ocean, depending on their own history. So they need food to eat. So here's some of the things they'll eat: caddisflies, mayflies, beetles, stoneflies, crayfish. Every time it just baffles me, but I have cut open a salmon and seen some of the things that these fish can eat. You'll be surprised given their body size. I also always throw in illegal keats because when I went to grad school, the juvenile Chinook salmon I was working with, they were in the southernmost extent of the species. So when the species are on the edge of like the northern or southernmost, you expect them to not do very well. You expect growth rates to be poor. And my fish had some of the highest growth rates. And the reason why is because it works out really nicely when you're in the river and there's an earthworm farm and the earthworms get all into the river. These fish were eating hot dogs all day long. But to summarize, in the end, fish need three things. They need cool, complex, clean water. It needs to be cool temperature so they're not being cooked alive, and also so it's not too hot, making them have to constantly eat. Complex, they need places to hide, to forage, to hunt. And clean, free of pesticides, free of sediment, free of too much sediment. And then population outlook. So there's a mix of historical and current impacts from human activities. We have habitat fragmentation, both natural and human processes. The area is dynamic, especially post-fire. Significant changes happen, and so there's times where, I always think Bonaparte Creek. So I'm not from a fire area in Minnesota. I was city gal. And coming out here and just seeing the aftermath of this little, creek that took out houses, and you just think of that for a fish and how dynamic that process must have been. It's not like they get much of a warning. So it can create a lot of new habitat, and it can get rid of a lot of habitat. Barriers to migration for fluvial and fluvial populations with roads, culverts, and different infrastructure that can cut off where they used to be able to pass through. If there's some barrier, they're no longer able to access. Agriculture is obviously very important. We need food, we need meat, we need crops to support population and population growth. But also it comes with cons. Water diversions, when, especially back in the day, they would use up the creek and the creek would run dry. Also non-screened intakes. So one thing DFW does is they always try to work with landowners to get fish screens so that they're not just sucking up fish into their irrigation. Timber harvest, logging and grazing. So with timber, you create roads, you have culverts, you have a lot of impacts, removal of riparian vegetation, especially in the past. And grazing. Cows will ruin a riparian area. I have seen some awful areas of just cows completely eroding the banks, flattening it out. It makes it so that it's so shallow, fish can get stranded, removes all the vegetation, lessens the insects for them to eat. And then mining, the sedimentation from it buries eggs and can also irritate the gills of fish in the area. And then contamination. So the outlook, actually it's nice for once in natural resources. I'm not doom and gloom, so this is fun. I spoke with our fish biologist for the district, and he says the populations have actually been improving since the 2000s. And the reason why is because the mid to late 90s, the riparian for forest practices, there was a riparian buffer instituted. So anytime there's a timber sale, whether it's DNR or small forest landowner, there is a buffer of you cannot harvest right there. You have to be within so many feet back. And so that right there protects the banks and protects the vegetation. The Loomis area specifically, he said, is susceptible to bedrock moving events. And so if you have significant changes, that can cut off habitat or it can create habitat. He also said one thing that they've noticed is that if the habitat is good, it can rebuild the population pretty quickly, but they're not good at finding the habitat. So we can restore miles and miles over here, but they're not very good at finding it. So that's really interesting to hear. And there's not a good understanding of predation. He said the mergansers do really well, and they're pretty successful, but otherwise there's not a lot of information. And even creating this PowerPoint, I realized there's a lot of the Okanogan Highlands that could be studied, should be studied, and just so much more information that could be collected. So improving the future, I think one thing starts with education. All of you out here today, this is fun to see a bunch of people spending their Friday night learning about fish. I'm hoping you guys are enjoying yourself. I was like, I can talk fish all day long. But I think it's really important for everyone to register the importance of these species. Ecologically, they're so critical. They're part of the food chain, so bears are going to eat them, they're going to help control insects, but then also when these fish are traveling and going out to these different lakes, rivers, streams, they're bringing back all those nutrients when they die. And they're introducing all these nutrients in fertilizer as they decompose. I don't know who has gardens out here? My kind of people. Well, fun fact, there's this jug called like Alaska fish fertilizer. Holy moly, it's amazing. Works great for my tomatoes, and my dogs love the smell, but fish are great fertilizer. Recreationally, it gets people outside. I feel like, kids, especially these days, they have an iPad in one hand, phone in the other. I'm guilty sometimes just doom scrolling, but it's nice to have, let's go try go fishing, get outside, go explore new areas. Oh, there's a new fishing area. Oh, my friend caught fish here. Just getting people outside and getting people excited. Culturally, they're important. Pacific salmon and steelhead trout are important for tribes. And then economically, we have the fishing industry, we have fish as food, just generates money back in here. There's plenty of people who come out here, especially at Bonaparte Lake, and buy those fishing passes and invest in the community there. So I just want to recognize some current work that's being completed. We have a lot of culvert replacements and fish passage restoration. So culverts are being restored, whether they're perched, so they're kind of balancing and water isn't going through, or sometimes culverts are kind of eroding away so fish can't get through, or sometimes they're undersized and get washed out. So there's a lot of work to restore the culverts and allow for fish passage. A lot of beaver-based restoration and process-based restoration. The Okanogan Highlands Alliance, Triple Creek, excuse me. Just looking at what the BDAs have done, I've been there twice, and it's just a year difference, and it's just crazy to see what those techniques can do for the ecosystem. And then also just data collection, habitat monitoring, and there's different, eDNA, snorkel surveys, red surveys. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the local partnerships that are out there. We have the federal agencies, the state agencies, the nonprofits, the tribes. Everyone's out there really just trying to work together, do work, and protect the resource. And so how can you help? Responsible recreation. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is in the summer, you're hot, you're like, okay, I want a nice deep pool. And so people build these things called rock dams. And they stack up rocks so that you have this nice little pool. That can be a fish passage barrier. And they're happening all across the state, all across the county. So please do not build them. Please educate people. Do not build these because this can be an issue for fish. Reporting fish passage barriers. If you see a culvert and you're like, this is going to impact fish, please call me, call the county, call WashDOT, depending on who it belongs to. Volunteer opportunities, working with the different agencies, partners, tribes, getting out there, or just having conversations even. And then one last plug is clean drain, dry practices to prevent spread of invasive species. So here's where I got some of my work. I have to do a shout out to Alan Schultz, the 2014 Fish of the Eastern Washington. He has 5 volumes, each volume is like 500 pages long, and the data and information is just beyond impressive, and they're all downloadable. And I'm going to do one more plug. So I was in Olympia. I literally drove back today from Olympia, and I was talking to a coworker who will be out here this summer. And they're trying to look for boreal white-faced dragonflies. Their habitat is in grassy ponds in the Okanogan Highlands. They're usually around June to early July. This is what they look like. If you think you see one, if you can report it to DFW or iNaturalist. And then I have contact information for the biologist Melinda Vickers. So essentially, after major droughts, many ponds dried up in the range, and they're no longer found in many areas. And so they're trying to figure out where they are. And then livestock grazing, invasive species, climate change has been impacting them. And she will be in the area in mid-June, and she's hopefully going to be giving a OHA talk also. But if any of you live specifically in the Chisaw area and have these ponds, she's looking for places to go survey and try to find these dragonflies. So if you might know a landowner, or you might be a landowner who's like, oh, we could ever come out here, that would be great. And that completes me talking to you guys for the last hour, so I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and let me know if you have any questions.